I've heard the word addiction a bit today.
Yes.
I've heard it in some of the past lectures too.
Yes.
Could you give us a little definition of addiction and maybe an example?
Sure. Most of you understand addiction from a physical perspective, don't you? So would you agree? For example, if I can give an example, I want to leave the word fear there because we want to discuss more about fear. So let's look at addiction. Okay, so physical addiction, what comes to mind? Drugs, alcohol, smoking, food, gambling, sex, okay. Anything else physically come to mind? Exercise, that's good. Okay.
Meditation.
Meditation, yes. Many New Age people will be upset with me saying that meditation is an addiction, but it actually is. Watching videos. That's an addiction too. Watching DT videos is even an addiction, yeah, I agree. And so we could list quite a few here, right? So there are physical addictions that we are aware of. What's the general nature of a physical addiction? What's the feeling in a person when they feel a physical addiction? If we have the mic over there, is there a... No, can I just... I want to have the...
I feel that it's anytime you're not engaged in those activities, that it raises something in you that you don't want to experience. So you go back to the experience of the addiction.
Excellent. So it's a compulsion to avoid something, isn't it? Is really what you're saying. So you feel compelled, as somebody yelled out, but in particular, it's a compulsion to avoid a feeling of some kind, isn't it? That's what it is. So any person who goes to any addiction has a compulsion to avoid a certain experience. Okay, so let's rub all those out now. They're the physical ones. Okay, and physical ones are easy to see. Right? You can see when a person has a compulsion. Many of you are addicted to coffee, right? You know you are because you have a compulsion to get up with it every morning. You can't give it up. Can't give it up. I'd say half of America is probably addicted to coffee, isn't it? Yeah? No? Yes? Okay. I'm not telling you have to stop drinking it. I'm just saying that it's an addiction. You notice too, one of the things I'd like to point out, and this is something to be careful of in my seminars, I'll point out a truth to you, and a lot of people think it's a judgment. There's a big difference between a judgment and a truth. I don't have a feeling towards you. If you want to drink coffee, you can drink as much as you want. Does that make sense? I'm just pointing out to you that it's an addiction. It's driven by some kind of compulsion to avoid some kind of emotion. One of the reasons why many of us do it right first thing in the morning is because we want to avoid just what happened when we were asleep in our sleep state. We want to avoid the memory of it. We want to avoid the feeling of it. We want to avoid the fear that we had coming back to the world. Even that's one of the reasons why many people do it first thing in the morning. That's why a lot of people, breakfast is a cigarette and a coffee. Two compulsions to avoid a whole group of emotions, right, that happened when they were asleep. So the addiction is a compulsion to avoid an experience. And usually when we're talking about an experience, we're talking about an emotional experience. Okay? Now, why do we have a compulsion to avoid an experience? Isn't it only because there is a fear of the experience? Isn't it? So can you see, addictions are created to avoid fear about experiences. Now, let's look at it from an emotional perspective, because that is a much more difficult way to examine our compulsions. From an emotional perspective, most people are totally clueless about their addictions emotionally. They can barely see their physical addictions, let alone their emotional ones. And the emotional ones all are driven by quite large fears, and fear prevents engagement of all of these things in a soul-based, pure desire in a passionate way. So can you see that addictions are going to be a major part, or addressing addictions are going to have to be a major part of looking at our fears. Our addictions tell us what our real fears are. Now, when we don't get our addictions met, what do? Most of us get angry. And when do you notice you're angry? For most people, they don't notice they're angry until they're actually very angry. They don't notice that actually it began sometimes with even just a mild irritation, a mild annoyance, a very mild feeling of, I don't want to be here type of feeling, a feeling of disengagement. They don't realise that a lot of it's driven by anger, right? So I would have to list under anger everything from rage to minor irritation. Right? And that's what I call angry. Every time we have an addiction that is not meant, we revert to anger. Every time we meet an addiction, our fear gets satiated, satisfied. In other words, it's not triggered, it's not exposed, it gets covered over. Yeah. And the only reason why we have these addictions are to avoid, and any time we want to avoid is an indication that we're afraid of something. All right? So, let's say we're in an environment like this. And I said, one of you, in the next 30 seconds, I'm going to ask to come up and speak for 5 minutes. And if I was really serious about it, how many of you would instantly be triggered into fear? Right? Okay, a few of you. And does that mean Americans are more talkative than Australians? Probably does. Because in Australia, you would have had like 3/4 of the audience put up their hand. And now, what fear is it covering over? What fear is it that we are experiencing in that moment? Afraid of personal exposure, afraid of making mistakes. There's all sorts of fears, isn't there? That other people laugh at us, that they'll humiliate us, that I want to humiliate you in some way. And there's all sorts of fears that might get triggered in that one thing that I'm asking somebody to do. Now, most people then go into addictions to avoid those fears. So what would be an addiction to avoid a fear of public speaking? If we use the microphone, so you put up your hand. Sorry, sometimes it's compelling to not put up your hand, but trying to teach our audiences to do that.
Learn how to be an excellent public speaker as you are.
Okay, so what we do is we go course after course after course after, and we have this exposure for months on end and months on end, and eventually we get that first gig, and we do the first gig, and and then we do the next and the next, and eventually the fear dies down because we've engaged a process.
Yes.
And a lot of that process is because we're avoiding the addictions, actually, isn't it? We're avoiding the addiction to having everybody like us, for example, Most of us are not prepared to engage what we want to speak about right now. We want to get ourselves ready. And getting ourselves ready is about avoiding certain fears every single time. So that's what we do. We engage a process of education and learning many times. We do it to get over it. What else do we do? Now, that's if we have to speak. What do the majority of us do? We avoid speaking at all in any public setting, don't we? Whenever we're in a group, where do we sit? As far away as possible from any person who's going to ask me to speak. Generally, that's what happens, right? If we had that particular addiction, that's what we would do. And we wouldn't confront it, generally. We would create a comfort zone. Isn't that what we do? Create a comfort-based life that prevents us from having to experience a lot of the things we're afraid of. So these addictions are about creating what we classify as personal comfort. That's why we do them. We do them because it's more comfortable to not have to be afraid than it is to feel afraid. But if we were truly humble, we would choose to feel our fear rather than doing this. And this is what we're facing. Now, with our emotional addictions, of course, are often much more intense than any physical addiction. And in fact, I prefer generally to deal with a person who's got a physical addiction because most of the time they know they've got one. But a person with an emotional addiction, they'll say, no, I don't. How dare you suggest such a thing? Or they'll go, is that really true? And they'll go off thinking, that's not true. Trying to help a person come face to face with their emotional addictions is often very difficult. And this is why we need to engage our own will to discover them rather than waiting or relying on somebody else to tell us what they are. We need to be prepared to see our own addictions. And unless you're prepared to see your own addictions, you will never expose your own fears. And trust me, you want to expose your own fears, because if you don't expose your own fears, you'll never get to feel them. And if you never feel them, you'll never do any of these other really positive things, because your fear will dominate your life. And if your fear dominates your life, you'll never be at one with God, ever. As long as your fear dominates your life, you will never be happy, you will never be joyful, you will never be loving, you will never be truthful even. You won't be humble. And then you'll convince yourself that it's all because you just don't have the faith. And really, for a lot of people, you know what it really is? They just don't want to feel their fear. So a lot of times, this fear dominates our very existence. It causes us to believe that we don't even have faith. It causes us to believe that we don't even have desires. Right? I see this happening in people's lives all the time. Like, I've sometimes had couples come up and they, a lot of times people want some kind of counselling, which generally we don't give, right? Because we're always wanting people to focus on their own lives and look at their own lives. But when they come up, they say, we love each other a lot, but we never have sex. And I go, yeah, that's really strange, actually. That's really strange. And they say, but we feel it's okay. And I go, it's not okay. It's really strange. Because that's telling me, sexual desire is an inbuilt desire that God placed into your real self. If you're not feeling one, right, and you're in a relationship that you say is loving and you're not feeling that desire, there's got to be a lot of fear. There's got to be a lot of fear about sex. There's got to be a lot of fear about control. There's got to be a lot of fear about giving your heart, receiving somebody's heart, all those kind of issues. There's got to be a lot involved with that if you're in a relationship and you feel pretty comfortable not having sex. Right? But most of them look at us like, that's not the answer that I wanted to hear, And so they walk away saying, he's just got nothing, no idea what he's talking about, as usual. Right? Instead, we need to notice one particular thing about fear. Fear suppresses, double P, sorry, yes. No, it's not one double P, is it? Suppresses will. Do you know what I mean by that? Every time you get afraid, you will convince yourself that you don't have a desire in a certain direction when you really do. every time you get afraid, you will convince yourself that the desire is not present when it really is. All right? And so there is this imperative that we address fear as an emotion. It has to be addressed. But when we have addictions, getting back to Frank's question, we are actually choosing to avoid the fear. Therefore, we are choosing to suppress our will, which is an interesting concept if you think about it. By living in our addictions, what we believe are our compulsions, in other words, what we believe our will is often what are our addictions, and they're actually being created in order to avoid the fear and suppress our true desire or will. Right? Now, if I can give you some examples of that with regard to this issue of sex. In Australia, there are many women who come along to our seminar. So if you have a look around in this seminar, you can see that the balance of men and women is pretty even, isn't it? This is very good, by the way, because it's an indication that the information being presented to you is evenly balanced on the feminine and masculine side for a start, right? But it also indicates that the people in the room have less injuries with regard to the opposition of the opposite gender and more of a generalised injury base. Does that make sense? So in other words, there's injuries about both genders more than injuries about one gender. Right? That's a good sign. Right? That's a good thing. Okay. Now, if you think about those kind of things and you go, okay, in Australia, sometimes have like 2/3, 3/4 of a group being women coming along, and most of them are single. And you know what they say to me about being single? They say they want to be. And I tell them they're liars. And they tell me I'm crazy. And that's about as far as it goes sometimes. The reality is, most of us do have a soul-based inbuilt desire. In fact, God inbuilt inside of us in our real self. So now I'm talking about the real self. I'll just rub out this side because we don't need that. We've got them in the right order now. In our real self, we are one half of a complete unit. So if this is me, my other half is it doesn't have to be the opposite gender, it's the opposite part of myself, the other part of myself. And the soul can be developed in this way, or it could be in this way. But there is another half of ourself, whatever the mixture is. They're the only three potential mixtures of how the soul is split. Now, if that's my real self, then what basically that's telling me is that God created me to share myself with the other half of myself, the other half of my real self. In other words, God created me to have a sexual interaction with my soulmate. That's God's creation, right? And if I'm avoiding that process, then I'm obviously shutting down a lot of fears, right? What kind of fears might I be shutting down? Well, it might be that I'm afraid that when I meet the other half of myself, that I won't like them. Which probably indicates that you don't like yourself very much as well, right? Or I might feel that I meet the other half of myself and they'll dominate me. They'll control me. And I don't want that to happen, so I'm afraid of control. I'm afraid of being controlled. So I don't want to meet them. But in the process of not wanting these things, I'm afraid, and because I'm afraid, I exercise my will to not meet the other half of myself. In other words, I exercise my will to avoid the other half of myself. It's very opposite of what God eventually wants us to be, how God eventually wants us to be happy, and in fact God created us to be such, is by engaging the other half of ourselves, not avoiding the other half of ourselves. Does that make sense? And obviously my fear turns off my desire to engage the other half of myself, and then I go around thinking, I don't need the other half of myself. I don't need men. I don't need a woman. When I say need, it's probably more, I don't want a man in my life. I don't want a woman in my life. The other half of myself in my life. And that's probably more honest. Because that's really what we're doing. We don't want them there, but we don't want them there not because of our true self, but because of our fears. And our fear is dominating, and so we then exercise our addiction. And in Australia, how many people are exercising their addiction is they live with another person of the same gender who they don't have any sexual relationship with, so that they can avoid loneliness, for example. So they can avoid being alone. And they're afraid of the feeling of being alone, of course, until they meet the other half of themselves. And so what they do is they live with somebody else to avoid that feeling. And you'd be surprised how many times we take actions and decisions based on avoidance. If you just start the back there.
Hi. I'm happy you brought that up because I remember seeing that video and I had a couple of questions and thoughts about it that I'd like to share. My first reaction was, around me I see a lot of people who always have to be in a relationship, and
Yes.
I see that that's kind of an addiction.
Certainly it is.
And my other thought was that I remember you saying that some people only meet their soulmate sometimes in the 6th dimension or much further on.
Mm-hmm.
And I remember hearing also you saying that if you're with someone who's not your soulmate, you could be preventing yourself from actually meeting your soulmate. And so I wonder, like, aren't there a lot of people that they're not feeling it and they really want to be developing themselves until it just feels right?
Yep. No, and this is the thing, is that we often don't develop these things about relationships because we're terrified. And these terrors get reflected in people's questions frequently, and also in media statements or attack of the teachings that I'm trying to teach. So in Australia, one of the biggest attacks that we get from the media is that we break up families. Right? Well, I've never broken up a family in my entire life. It's impossible for me to break up a family when I don't tell anybody what to do, for a start, right? So it's impossible. Secondly, I don't tell people what to do with regard to their relationships. This is me, I think. Just let me fix this. I'm okay here. I'll just check my gear over there. Do any of you have iPads on, like stuff that's got Wi-Fi or anything on at the moment? Would you mind just turning the Wi-Fi portion of it off, so that it or the phone-based portion of it off, so that we don't get clicks in the sound? And I'll just to make sure that everything else is all right here. It's not there, so anyway. Okay, so if we look at this issue of soulmates, what I'm trying to do is say to people this: God created you to be supremely happy. And the way God did it, one of the ways God did it, in fact, was to create you as being a half of you, and eventually you'd find the other half of you, and the other half of you is going to have a very similar passionate desire and nature and personality as you. In other words, you're going to eventually get along really well. Right? And God created it that way, that you only would have that one person. Does that make sense? Just let me continue. And so in creation of that, what God has done is created this concept of soulmates. Now, I didn't create it. So it's impossible for me to break up a family or create a family. I didn't create the concept of soulmates. God did. All I'm doing is telling you about it. Does that make sense? Secondly, in telling you about it, I'm suggesting to you that when you engage your true passions and desires and engage your true will, not the will to create a facade or your injuries, but your true will, you will engage this process of getting to know you. Once you start doing that, you'll start engaging your life with passionate desire in the areas that you want to go in. And in that process, you will, in fact, draw the other half of yourself to yourself. Well, it's an automatic process. Now, if you're married and the other half of yourself is not the person you're married to, then you're going to eventually still love them because love would also always dominate every relationship, but you'll realise at the end that the other person is not your soulmate, and so you'll want to leave them. You will. That's a natural thing that will occur. I can't prevent that from occurring. It's going to happen sometime in your future if you're not with your soulmate right now. It's going to happen. And there's nothing I can do to stop it from happening. And from God's perspective, there's probably not much you can do either. All of God's laws have been created to help you discover the other half of yourself. And so sooner or later, you're going to discover the other half of yourself. Does that make sense? The key is what you choose to do out of harmony with love in the interim. If you choose to act in addiction before you meet the other half of yourself, by avoiding or being with people because of wanting certain addictions met, then it's going to slow down the process of you discovering the other half of yourself. So you only create a rod for your own back. That's all you do. And this is all you do with all of God's laws. Every time you work against the way God's created the universe to be, all you're doing is just creating a rod for your own back. No one else's, really, for yourself. And if you loved, no matter who you were with, you would treat them lovingly. You would never get angry with them and upset with them and dump on them or any of those things. You would always treat them lovingly. So a person who loves would not avoid the process of confronting their fears about meeting their soulmate, but they also wouldn't avoid their fears about being alone. They would process their way through both sets of emotions. Right? And this is something that I feel happens frequently, is that we have very strong emotional addictions because of the fears that we have. And as a result, we often avoid exercising our will in harmony with what that universally I feel is demonstrated by now, that each of us have a partner of some kind, right? We've been created to be such. So I feel it's a universal creation. If you look at it in nature, you see it in humanity. And yet, we still avoid the process of discovering because we're afraid. There are going to be many truths that you get that are presented to you, that you discover through the process of this growth, that you will find confronting. But you will only find them confronting because you have a fear associated with them. That's the only reason why they're confronting. Because God created everything based on love. Now, if everything is created on love, it's impossible for you to get hurt through the process of engaging these qualities. It's impossible. It's only possible to be hurt by not engaging these qualities, actually. By not wanting to grow, by acting in fear, it's only possible to be hurt that way. That's the only way that you can get hurt. In other words, the only way you can get hurt is by using your will to not engage the process of growth of love in your soul. That's the only way you can, at the end, get hurt. And all of the hurts you've experienced up till now have all been the result of somebody or yourself not engaging your will in harmony with love. In other words, someone controlling your will out of harmony with love, such as many of our parents have done, or you controlling your own will out of harmony with love, doing things that are out of harmony with love. That's the only source of potential hurt that there is, in fact. Right? Those two sources. So every time we avoid our fears, we need to start seeing that what we're actually doing is harming ourselves. And if our addictions help us avoid our fears, our addictions, no matter how innocent they seem, are harmful to ourselves, to our development. And for that reason, it's very important that at some point we develop the desire to find all of our emotional addictions and release their cause from ourselves. Otherwise, we are preventing our fears using our addictions, and we will never be happy, never be the happy people we would like to be. Now, a lot of people believe that they can meet their addictions and become happy. I'm pretty sure the average drug user feels that way, right? Don't they? But what eventually happens to the average drug user, have you noticed? They eventually, many of them even die as a result of their addiction. They are extremely unhappy. They have usually lost most of their friends by the end of the process. They have usually lost most of their will. They are completely under the control of their addiction, and they are extremely unhappy. And this is the result of acting in addictions, whether they be emotional or physical. The result is always going to be more unhappiness. So it's really important for us to see the importance of addressing addictions and to see that they're all being created because of fears, and to develop a desire to find them all ourselves. Not have someone else tell you what they all are, but to actually find them yourself. Right? That's the most important thing you can engage. Now, somebody like myself might be able to feel a lot of your addictions and tell you what they are, but to be honest, if you haven't spent the time trying to find them yourself, it's highly likely you won't even hear a word that that person has said to you. Yep. Very likely. And in fact, I've known people now for the last 6 years, which was, if you think of Lamar's original question, I've known people now who've known me for the last 6 years. I've had hundreds of hours of conversations with them about their addictions, and not a single one of their addictions has ever shifted. Now, how can that happen? It's because their fear is dominating their will to not do anything about their addictions. And it doesn't matter how much I try to convince you that you have a certain addiction, if you have no desire to address it inside of yourself, you will not address it. There has to be some sincere desire that comes from within yourself to address it before you will address the addiction. And it doesn't matter, you can go to as many Tony Robbins seminars as you like. Right? He's not going to convince you to address your addiction unless you have a desire to address your addiction. In other words, you could be with the most, flamboyant speaker who's really motivational, and at the end of the day, you are not going to address your addiction unless you want to. Now, in my opinion, you're far better off, saving that money that you would have spent going to that person, and develop instead your will to find your addictions and see all of your own fears.